Alright guys, MTech Guy here. Now then, do you own a BMW with the N52 engine? Great little engine, one of the most reliable engines BMW ever produced. They've got a lovely power curve and they sound pretty awesome with the right exhaust. One of the negatives with these engines though is that they love to leak oil. So if you do own a BMW from this era with the N52 engine, if it isn't leaking oil already, it will be doing sometime in the near future. So it's something that you're going to have to deal with, all as part of ownership of owning a BMW with the N52 engine. Guys, the gaskets are popping. Let's go and check out some of the areas where these engines love to leak oil. Alright, so before we get too carried away, let's just understand why these engines love to leak oil. Well, to start off with, pretty much all the gaskets are made from rubber, and over time that rubber starts to deteriorate. It becomes hard due to the age and especially the heat cycles the engine goes through over time, and eventually that rubber will become cracked. It'll also retain its memory in its compressed state, so it'll lose its efficiency in its sealing quality. So it's inevitable over time these rubber seals are going to start to become leaky. Now, another area on these engines that can cause these oil leaks to accelerate, that can just encourage them to start leaking, is the CCV system, the PCV system, or the oil separator, whatever you want to call it. So what can happen over time is they can start failing, and then it's going to build up that crankcase pressure inside the engine, and that's going to put pressure on the seals obviously, and it's going to cause them to leak. You'll be pushing that oil from inside to the outside of the engine. So before you get carried away replacing any of your engine seals, you want to make sure your CCV system is in good shape, or you're going to be up against it from day one. So the early N52 engines had the old style oil separator underneath the intake manifold there with the hoses and whatnot. Then the later type had it incorporated into the valve cover itself. So either which one you've got, it doesn't matter, just make sure that your CCV system's in good shape before you get carried away replacing oil seals. Alright, so we'll start at the top of the engine here. We'll start off with the oil filler cap. Now this has a rubber seal underneath it there, and that can start letting go over time. Now you're not going to see the oil leak initially just from looking at the engine like we are today, because of course you've got this plastic cover in the way, but once you get this up and off, maybe you're doing that for some other repairs, spark plugs, coil packs, whatever, then you will see this oil start pooling underneath there, that little recess in the valve cover underneath the plastic cover there. So that's a good place to start. Next up, a super common oil leak area on these engines is the valve cover gasket itself. Now when these start leaking, obviously because the engine's sort of tilted that way, being a straight six, you'll often find that you'll see the oil leaking right down underneath the valve cover there, and also it'll dribble on top of your exhaust manifold. So often you might see a little bit of smoke, but you'll certainly smell it inside the cab there, because it'll be burning off as you start the vehicle up. So this one is very easy to identify, it's worth keeping an eye out for, and like I say, it's super common on these engines. Alright, so sticking with the valve cover area, underneath this plastic cover, what you've got is a Valvetronic motor that's bolted to the side of the valve cover there, just at the top. Now this has a little gasket behind it, and this can start leaking also, and then this will dribble down, and then of course with the engine leaning this way like before, it'll dribble down this side, so you might confuse this with a valve cover gasket issue. Now the Valvetronic motor gasket failing isn't as common as the valve cover gasket itself, but it is worth chucking a new one in if you have got the valve cover off to do the valve cover gasket anyhow. It's just going to give you that insurance and that peace of mind. Alright, so moving on, another super common part that loves to leak oil on these cars is the oil filter housing gasket. Now of course you've got this aluminium housing here where your oil filter is situated, and this is bolted to the engine itself. Now between the two halves you've got like a funny looking shaped O-ring piece, and this deteriorates over time. These love to leak oil. Now it's not too easy to identify this. Normally the oil leak will build up over time before you do notice it. If it's just a small weep, like I say, it's not super easy to identify. Normally if you get a torch down here, you can see it down the side of the engine, but you'll especially see it on top of the belts there. It'll start contaminating the belts, so this is something that you want to jump on straight away if you haven't done it already on your engine. And if you do notice any residue whatsoever, just get on top of it straight away, because what can happen over time is it'll contaminate your drive belts, and then this in turn Can cause issues with the belt itself, and what can happen over time is that belt can actually get sucked in behind the crankshaft pulley, and what will happen is it'll just eat its way into your crankshaft seal and then end up shredded inside your engine, and you don't want that. And it can all be prevented very easily by replacing this very cheap gasket. So if you haven't done it already, get it done, and any signs of oil coming from there, get it sorted before it causes you a huge headache later on. And while you're in the process of replacing the oil filter housing gasket, there's the oil filter cooler gasket at the same time that's really worth doing. So get the two done at the same time, it's a good job done. Alright, so another area that isn't that common, they don't like to leak oil that often, but it can happen, so it's worth keeping an eye out for, is the two cam sensors at the front of the engine here. They have a little O-ring on them where they bolt into the engine. And like I say, it's not too common, but you will notice it when they do start letting go. You'll see some oil on the front of the head there, so worth keeping an eye out for. And same with your Vanos solenoids as well. Now this is part of your variable valve timing. They've got O-rings on them also. They can start letting go over time, so it's worth keeping an eye out for, but like I say, it's not that common. And there's also the crankshaft sensor down the bottom of the engine there. Now it's the same sort of thing as your cam sensors, not that common, but it does have that little O-ring on there that can let go over time. And then last up, right down the bottom of the engine there, is the oil pan gasket, or your oil sump gasket. Now this is pretty common, but it's not going to come about till the car's got about 80 to 100,000 miles on the clock, or a few years. It will happen eventually, but you've got to get past that point before it will let go, and that'll start weeping. Usually this will start dripping oil. You'll see it trickling down the side of the oil pan itself once you've got that plastic under tray out the way, and whenever you do remove that plastic under tray, you'll often see oil pooling on the top side of it, so it's worth keeping an eye out if you've got a few thousand miles on the clock. Now it can be a little bit of a tricky job to replace the oil pan gasket. You've got to drop the front subframe, you've got to drop the steering rack, and then that'll give you access to pull the oil pan off itself, chuck a new gasket on, put it all back together. Now normally you can get away with just dropping the subframe and the steering rack just slightly, just enough to shimmy that oil pan out of there, but it's not that bad. You can get it done with a bit of patience and using your imagination. Alright guys, so there we have it. That's some of the areas where these N52 engines love to leak oil. So if you own a BMW with an N52 engine, there's going to be plenty there to keep you busy, to keep you out of trouble. If you found the video interesting or useful, don't forget to give it a like, and make sure you go and check out the rest of my YouTube channel for more BMW DIY videos. Consider subscribing if that's your cup of tea. I'm MTech Guy. Thanks a lot for watching.